There's a pattern in global food systems that has allowed a single family to control what 3 billion people eat, how much they pay for it, and whether they eat at all. This isn't about restaurants or grocery stores. This is about the invisible infrastructure that determines whether food exists in the first place. Let me show you what total food control looks like. Rome, 50 AD. The Aurelius family controlled Egypt's grain exports, the bread distribution networks, and the shipping routes that fed the empire. When Claudius needed to feed Rome's million citizens, he didn't negotiate with farmers. He negotiated with one family. They set the price, they controlled the supply. They decided who ate and who starved. At their peak, the Aurelius controlled the calories that kept the Roman Empire alive. Then Emperor Vespasian discovered they were manipulating grain supplies to control imperial policy. The family was executed, their assets seized, and their trade networks nationalized. Overnight, the most powerful food dynasty in human history was erased. Jump forward 400 years. The Medici family in Renaissance Florence. They didn't just control banking. They controlled the spice trade routes from Asia, the grain imports from Sicily, and the salt monopolies that preserved food across Europe. Lorenzo de' Medici could starve any Italian city-state into submission simply by cutting off their food supply chains. When France needed grain during the harvest failures of 1482, they didn't negotiate with farmers or traders. They negotiated with one family. The Medici set terms, controlled distribution, and determined which regions ate and which regions faced famine. At their height, the Medici controlled food access for 15 million Europeans. Then the Portuguese discovered direct sea routes to Asia, bypassing Medici-controlled trade networks. Their food monopoly collapsed within a decade. The family that had controlled European food security for 2 centuries became irrelevant. Now let's look at the most recent example before today. The Dreyfus family, 1850 to 1960. Louis Dreyfus et Compagnie controlled grain exports from Russia, Argentina, and the American Midwest. They owned the ships, the storage facilities, and the trading networks that moved grain across continents. When Europe faced food shortages during World War I, governments didn't negotiate with farmers or regional traders. They negotiated with one family. The Dreyfus controlled wheat prices, shipping schedules, and food distribution that determined which nations could feed their populations during wartime. At their peak in 1920, they controlled 40% of global grain trade. Then Stalin nationalized Russian grain exports. Argentina created state trading companies, and the US established agricultural commodity programs. By 1960, the Dreyfus monopoly was broken, their market share decimated, and their control over global food security eliminated. 3 families, 3 different centuries, 3 complete monopolies over food systems, each believing they were untouchable, each controlling what entire civilizations ate, and each ultimately destroyed when governments realized the danger of allowing private families to control human survival. And here's what should terrify you. The Cargill family has already achieved greater food control than the Aurelius, the Medici, and the Dreyfus combined. They don't control 40% of global grain trade, they control 70%. They don't influence food prices in one region. They set food prices on 6 continents. They don't supply food during emergencies. They determine whether emergencies become famines. We're not approaching the pattern. We're deep inside it. This is the story of how one family gained control over human food security, why they're more powerful than any food dynasty in history, and why their invisible empire determines whether 3 billion people eat tomorrow. Before we go through the pattern, you need to understand what food system control actually means in practice. Not theoretical market influence, actual control over human survival. When you control seed genetics, you determine what farmers can grow. When you control commodity trading, you set the price farmers receive and consumers pay. When you control processing facilities, you determine what food gets made and where it gets distributed. When you control logistics networks, you decide which regions get food and which face shortages. That's not market participation, that's system control. The Cargill family doesn't compete in food markets, they are the food market. That's not theoretical, That's what happened to Rome, Florence, and the global grain trade. Let's look at how it actually played out. Chapter 1. Rome's Food Empire. Let's start with the Aurelius family, 30 AD to 71 AD. This is the original blueprint for total food system control. Marcus Aurelius Corvus didn't inherit farmland. He inherited something more valuable, the contracts to manage Egypt's grain exports to Rome. In 30 AD, when Augustus established the Egyptian grain tribute, he needed someone to organize the logistics of feeding Rome's growing population. The Aurelius family controlled the Nile River transport barges that moved grain from Egyptian farms to Alexandria's port. They owned the warehouse complexes where grain was stored before shipping. They managed the merchant fleet that carried grain across the Mediterranean to Rome's port at Ostia. They weren't farmers or traders. They were the infrastructure that made feeding the Roman Empire possible. By 40 AD, the Aurelius had expanded beyond logistics. They controlled the seed distribution that determined what Egyptian farmers planted each season. They set the quotas that determined how much grain each region had to produce for export. They owned the processing mills that turned raw grain into flour for Roman bread. They managed the distribution networks that moved food from Roman ports to the city's neighborhoods. When Romans lined up for their daily bread ration, they were eating food that had passed through Aurelius-controlled systems at every single stage of production. Stage 1 was infrastructure capture. The Aurelius family identified that controlling transportation and storage gave them more power than owning farms. They bought river barges, port facilities, and warehouse complexes. They established exclusive contracts with ship captains and dock workers. They created bottlenecks in the food system where nothing moved without their approval. This wasn't gradual expansion. This was systematic acquisition of choke points in the supply chain. Stage 2 was supply chain integration. The Aurelius began controlling agricultural inputs and processing outputs. They distributed seeds to Egyptian farmers, determining what varieties were planted each season. They established milling operations that processed grain into flour, controlling the transformation of raw crops into consumable food. They created exclusive trading relationships with farmers, offering guaranteed purchases in exchange for exclusive selling rights. By 45 AD, Egyptian grain production was organized around Aurelius requirements, not market demand. Stage 3 was price control mechanisms. The Aurelius family discovered they could manipulate food prices by controlling storage and release timing. They built massive granaries that could store grain for months, allowing them to create artificial scarcity during peak demand periods. They coordinated with ship captains to slow or accelerate deliveries based on price movements. They established regional distribution centers that could flood or starve specific markets depending on their strategic objectives. By 50 AD, bread prices in Rome reflected Aurelius' decisions, not supply and demand. Stage 4 was political influence through food leverage. The Aurelius began using their food control to influence imperial policy. When Emperor Claudius proposed new taxes on Egyptian trade, grain shipments to Rome mysteriously decreased, causing bread shortages and public unrest until the proposal was withdrawn. When senators criticized Egyptian tribute policies, their home regions experienced delays in grain deliveries until they changed their positions. The family that had started as logistics contractors was now dictating policy to the Roman government through food manipulation. Stage 5 was complete dependency creation. By 55 AD, Rome's survival depended entirely on Aurelius-controlled food systems. The city's population had grown to over 800,000 people who needed daily bread rations to survive. Egypt provided 60% of Rome's grain supply, and the Aurelius controlled 90% of Egyptian grain exports. Alternative supply chains from Sicily and North Africa existed, but couldn't replace Egyptian volumes if the Aurelius cut off shipments. Rome's senators, citizens, and even the emperor knew that the Aurelius family could trigger famine in the imperial capital within weeks. Stage 6 was overreach and exposure. Marcus Aurelius Corvus made a fatal calculation in 69 AD during the year of 4 emperors. He believed his food control made him more powerful than any individual emperor, so he began manipulating grain supplies to determine which candidates succeeded in their bids for imperial power. He cut off grain shipments to Rome during Otho's reign, supporting Vitellius's claim to the throne. Then he restored shipments, when Vitellius gained power, expecting political rewards for his support. But Vespasian defeated Vitellius and discovered evidence of Aurelius' manipulation in the imperial archives. Stage 7 was systematic destruction. Vespasian understood that no private family could be allowed to control Roman food security. In 71 AD, he issued the Edict of Grain Security, which nationalized all Egyptian grain exports, seized Aurelius' assets throughout the empire, and executed the family leadership for treason. The Aurelius shipping fleet was transferred to imperial control. Their warehouse complexes became state property. Their exclusive trading contracts were voided and replaced with direct government management. Within 6 months, the most powerful food dynasty in the ancient world was completely eliminated. By 72 AD, the Aurelius family went from controlling the food supply of 800,000 Romans to being a cautionary tale about the dangers of private food monopolies. The descendants of Marcus Aurelius Corvus, if any survived the executions, were forbidden from participating in grain trade and lived as minor landowners in rural provinces. The infrastructure that had made them the secret rulers of Rome became the foundation of imperial food security. That's what total food system control looks like. And that's what happens when governments realize that private families have gained the power to determine who lives and who dies through food manipulation. Chapter 2. The Medici Food Network. Let's jump forward 400 years to Renaissance Florence, 1400 to 1530. The Medici family perfected what the Aurelius had started, creating the first truly global food control network. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici understood something the banking historians miss. Money was worthless if people were starving. In 1400, when he established the Medici Bank, he simultaneously created trading networks that controlled food imports into Florence, Milan, and Rome. The Medici didn't just loan money to merchants. They owned the ships that carried spices from Constantinople, the warehouses that stored grain from Sicily, and the distribution networks that supplied salt to preserve food across Italy. They weren't banking fortune. They were building food system control disguised as banking. By 1430, under Cosimo de' Medici, the family had expanded beyond Italian food networks. They controlled spice imports from India through their trading posts in Constantinople and Alexandria. They managed grain exports from Sicily and Sardinia through exclusive contracts with local nobles. They owned salt production facilities from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. They established wool trading networks that connected English sheep farms to Flemish textile production to Italian finishing markets. The Medici had created the first intercontinental supply chain that connected food production, processing, and distribution across Europe and Asia. Stage 1 was financial infrastructure capture. The Medici established banks in every major European trading city, but the real power was in the trade financing they provided for food imports. Italian cities needed grain from Sicily, spices from Asia, and preserved foods for winter survival. The Medici didn't just provide loans for these purchases. They owned the ships, controlled the trading routes, and managed the storage facilities that made international food trade possible. By 1420, European food imports moved through Medici-controlled infrastructure. Stage 2 was geographic monopolization. The Medici systematically eliminated competition in key food trading routes. They established exclusive trading relationships with spice merchants in Constantinople, grain producers in Sicily, and salt miners across the Mediterranean. They bought out competing trading companies, established preferential shipping contracts, and created financial incentives that made dealing with non-Medici traders economically impossible. By 1440, the major food import routes to Italy were Medici monopolies. Stage 3 was processing and distribution control. The Medici began owning food processing facilities and urban distribution networks. They established grain mills, spice grinding operations, and food preservation facilities. They created retail networks in Florence, Rome, and Milan that supplied processed foods to urban populations. They owned the bakeries that made bread, the markets that sold meat, and the taverns that served meals. By 1450, Italians weren't just buying food that had been imported through Medici networks. They were eating food that had been processed and sold through Medici-owned facilities. Stage 4 was political leverage through food dependency. Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, realized that controlling food imports gave the family more political power than banking wealth. When the Papal States resisted Medici influence, Lorenzo cut off grain shipments from Sicily, causing food shortages in Rome, until Pope Sixtus IV agreed to Medici banking terms. When French armies invaded Italy in 1494, Lorenzo's son Piero negotiated not just financial terms, but food supply guarantees, ensuring French troops would be fed through Medici-controlled networks. The family that had started as bankers was now determining the outcome of wars through food logistics. Stage 5 was international dependency creation. By 1500, European food security depended on Medici-controlled trade networks. Italian cities relied on Medici grain imports for 70% of their food supply. Northern European cities depended on Medici spice imports for food preservation and preparation. Even France and England used Medici trading networks for luxury food imports and seasonal grain purchases during harvest failures. The Medici family had become the invisible infrastructure that kept European populations fed. Stage 6 was overreach and strategic vulnerability. Giovanni de' Medici, Lorenzo's grandson, made the same mistake as the Roman Aurelius family. He began using food control to manipulate international politics, cutting off supplies to regions that opposed Medici interests and creating artificial famines to force political concessions. But in 1498, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around Africa, bypassing the Ottoman-controlled Mediterranean trade routes that were the foundation of Medici power. Suddenly, spices could be imported directly from Asia without passing through Medici-controlled trading posts. Stage 7 was systematic displacement and collapse. The Portuguese sea route to Asia destroyed the Medici monopoly on spice imports, which had been their most profitable food trade. Spanish conquests in the Americas created new sources of precious metals that financed alternative trading networks. French and English merchants established their own direct relationships with grain producers, eliminating the need for Medici intermediaries. By 1520, European food imports were flowing through Portuguese, Spanish, and English networks that completely bypassed Medici control. By 1530, the Medici family went from controlling European food security to being regional Italian nobles with limited influence. Their banks failed, their trading networks collapsed, and their political power evaporated. The family that had determined what Europeans ate for 130 years became irrelevant within a single generation. Lorenzo de' Medici's descendants became minor Tuscan dukes, whose primary concern was managing local agricultural estates. The infrastructure that had given them control over European food systems was replaced by national trading companies and royal monopolies that served state interests rather than private family power. That's what happens when technological changes and geopolitical shifts eliminate the choke points that private families use to control food systems. The pattern played out again. Chapter 3. The Dreyfus Global Grain Empire. Now let's look at the most recent example before today. The Louis Dreyfus et Compagnie Empire, 1850 to 1960. This is the closest historical parallel to what the Cargill family has achieved today. Leopold Louis Dreyfus understood that the Industrial Revolution had created unprecedented opportunities for food system control. In 1851, he established Louis Dreyfus et Compagnie not as a regional trading company, but as a global grain empire designed to control food flows between continents. The expansion of railroad networks, steamship technology, and telegraph communications made it possible to coordinate food trading operations across Europe, Asia, and the Americas simultaneously. Dreyfus didn't want to dominate grain trading in one region. He wanted to control international grain markets completely. By 1870, Louis Dreyfus et Compagnie had established operations in Odessa, controlling Russian wheat exports, in Buenos Aires managing Argentine grain shipments, and in Chicago coordinating American Midwest agricultural exports. They owned grain elevators, shipping fleets, and storage facilities on 3 continents. They employed thousands of grain traders, ship captains, and warehouse managers who coordinated global food movements according to Dreyfus family strategic objectives. This wasn't a trading company that bought and sold grain. This was a global food infrastructure empire that controlled how grain moved from farms to cities worldwide. Stage 1 was geographic infrastructure capture. The Dreyfus family systematically acquired grain storage and transportation infrastructure in every major grain-producing region. They built massive grain elevators along the Volga River in Russia, the Paraná River in Argentina, and the Mississippi River in America. They purchased steamship fleets that could transport grain across the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. They established telegraph networks that allowed them to coordinate grain movements and price decisions across continents in real time. By 1880, global grain trade moved through Dreyfus-controlled infrastructure. Stage 2 was farmer dependency creation. Louis Dreyfus et Compagnie established exclusive purchasing contracts with grain farmers across Russia, Argentina, and the American Midwest. They provided advance payments, farming equipment, and transportation services that made farmers dependent on Dreyfus networks for their economic survival. They offered guaranteed purchase agreements that seemed beneficial to farmers, but included clauses that gave Dreyfus control over planting decisions, harvest timing, and grain quality specifications. By 1890, millions of grain farmers were essentially contracted employees of the Dreyfus Empire. Stage 3 was price manipulation and market control. The Dreyfus family discovered they could control international grain prices by coordinating storage and release decisions across their global network. When European wheat prices were high, they could flood markets with grain from Argentina. When American corn prices dropped, they could redirect shipments to Asian markets where prices remained strong. They created artificial scarcity in some regions while creating oversupply in others, always ensuring maximum profit for Dreyfus operations, while maintaining control over global grain flows. Stage 4 was government dependency and political leverage. By 1900, European governments realized they were dependent on Dreyfus-controlled grain imports for their national food security. When Germany needed wheat during harvest failures in 1902, they negotiated directly with Louis Dreyfus et Compagnie, not with Russian or American grain farmers. When Britain required food supplies during World War I, Dreyfus grain shipments were coordinated with British naval operations to ensure continued food imports, despite German submarine threats. The company that had started as a grain trader had become essential infrastructure for national survival. Stage 5 was wartime control and international dependency. During World War I, the Dreyfus family controlled grain shipments that determined which nations could feed their populations during wartime rationing. They managed grain imports to Britain, France, and Italy that prevented widespread famine despite agricultural labor shortages. They coordinated with American agricultural programs to supply grain to European allies, while maintaining profitable operations across neutral and belligerent nations. By 1918, Louis Dreyfus et Compagnie was the invisible infrastructure that kept Allied populations fed during the most destructive war in human history. Stage 6 was overreach and political resistance. Pierre-Louis Dreyfus, Leopold's son, made the critical mistake of treating governments as customers rather than sovereign authorities. In 1925, he began demanding political concessions from European governments in exchange for grain shipments, including favorable trade agreements, tax exemptions, and protection from agricultural competitors. He threatened grain supply disruptions when governments proposed regulations that would limit Dreyfus market power. The family that had become essential for food security was now seen as a threat to national sovereignty. Stage 7 was nationalization and systematic dismantlement. The global economic crisis of 1929 gave governments the justification and opportunity to eliminate private control over food security. Stalin nationalized all Russian grain exports, eliminating Dreyfus operations in the Soviet Union overnight. Argentina established state-controlled grain marketing boards that took over grain exports from private companies. The United States created agricultural commodity support programs that provided farmers with alternatives to Dreyfus purchasing contracts. Britain established government-managed food import systems that bypassed private grain trading companies. By 1940, Louis Dreyfus et Compagnie went from controlling 40% of global grain trade to being a minor regional commodity trader. The Dreyfus family lost their Russian operations, their Argentine infrastructure, and their American grain contacts within a decade. World War II completed their elimination as a global power, as governments created state-controlled food systems that treated private food monopolies as national security threats. The infrastructure that had given them control over international grain markets was nationalized, regulated, or replaced with government-managed alternatives. By 1960, the descendants of Léopold Louis Dreyfus were managing small-scale commodity trading operations in France and Switzerland. The global grain empire that had controlled food flows between continents became a footnote in agricultural history. The pattern played out again. Private families that gain control over food systems inevitably face government intervention that eliminates their power. But here's where the pattern diverges. Louis Dreyfus et Compagnie controlled 40% of global grain trade at their peak. The Cargill family controls 70% of global agricultural commodity flows today and operates in political and economic conditions that make government intervention far more difficult than it was in 1930. Chapter 4. The Cargill Food Empire. And here's what should keep you awake at night. The Cargill family is following the exact same pattern as the Aurelius, Medici, and Dreyfus empires, but they've achieved a level of food system control that surpasses all previous food monopolies combined. Stage by stage, acquisition by acquisition, they've built the most comprehensive private food empire in human history. Stage 1 was infrastructure capture, exactly like their predecessors. William Wallace Cargill established Cargill, incorporated in 1865, by purchasing grain elevators along railroad lines in Minnesota and Iowa. But unlike previous food monopolies that focused on single regions, the Cargill family understood that American agricultural expansion would create opportunities for continental-scale infrastructure control. They systematically acquired grain storage facilities, railroad terminals, and shipping access points throughout the American Midwest. They bought grain elevators in Minneapolis, storage facilities in Chicago, and shipping terminals on the Great Lakes. By 1900, grain farmers in Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin were selling their crops through Cargill-owned infrastructure. This wasn't regional grain trading. This was systematic control over American agricultural infrastructure, just like the Roman Aurelius family, just like the Medici trading networks, just like the Dreyfus global operations. Check. Stage 2 was vertical integration and supply chain control. The Cargill family began acquiring seed companies, fertilizer distributors, and agricultural equipment manufacturers. They purchased feed mills that processed grain for livestock. They established meatpacking operations that slaughtered cattle, pigs, and poultry. They created transportation networks that moved agricultural products from farms to processing facilities to retail distribution. By 1950, Cargill controlled agricultural inputs, processing operations, and distribution networks across multiple agricultural sectors. Farmers weren't just selling crops to Cargill. They were buying seeds from Cargill, using fertilizers from Cargill, and shipping products through Cargill networks. Just like the Medici control over spice processing and distribution, just like the Dreyfus coordination of global grain flows. Check. Stage 3 was geographic expansion and international market capture. The Cargill family expanded operations beyond American agriculture to establish food system control across continents. They built grain terminals in Argentina, processing facilities in Brazil, and trading operations in Europe and Asia. They established palm oil plantations in Indonesia, sugar mills in Mexico, and cotton processing facilities in West Africa. They created shipping networks that transported agricultural commodities between continents and storage facilities that allowed them to control timing of international food flows. By 1980, Cargill operations influenced agricultural markets on every inhabited continent. Just like the Dreyfus International Grain Empire, just like the Medici transcontinental trading networks. Check. Stage 4 was genetic and technological control. This is where the Cargill family surpassed their historical predecessors. They began acquiring biotechnology companies that developed genetically modified seeds, controlling not just the transportation and processing of crops, but the genetic characteristics of crops themselves. They purchased Mosaic Company, becoming one of the world's largest fertilizer producers. They acquired animal genetics companies that control breeding programs for livestock. They established agricultural technology firms that provide precision farming equipment and data analytics to farmers. By 2000, Cargill controlled not just agricultural infrastructure, but the biological and technological foundations of modern food production. No historical precedent exists for this level of agricultural system control. Check. Stage 5 was financial integration and farmer dependency creation. Cargill established agricultural lending programs that provide farmers with credit for seed purchases, equipment acquisition, and land expansion. They created agricultural insurance programs that protect farmers from crop failures and market fluctuations. They offer commodity futures contracts that allow farmers to guarantee crop sales before planting. They provide agricultural consulting services that guide farming decisions. Today, millions of farmers worldwide are financially dependent on Cargill for credit, insurance, guaranteed sales, and technical advice. This isn't just purchasing crops from farmers. This is controlling farmers' economic survival and agricultural decision-making. This exceeds the dependency relationships created by the Dreyfus family or any previous agricultural empire. Check. Stage 6 is where we are right now. Complete food system integration and political influence. Cargill today controls approximately 70% of global grain trade, 60% of international meat processing, 40% of global fertilizer production, and 25% of agricultural biotechnology development. They determine what crops farmers plant through seed sales and genetic licensing. They control crop pricing through commodity trading operations. They manage food processing through their manufacturing facilities. They influence food distribution through their logistics networks. They shape agricultural policy through lobbying operations and regulatory capture. The scope of this current control is staggering when examined in detail. Cargill owns 275 grain elevators across the American Midwest that store 1.2 billion bushels of grain annually. Their processing facilities slaughter 8.5 million cattle, 32 million hogs, and 1.8 billion chickens each year. Their shipping networks transport 150 million tons of agricultural commodities across oceans annually through their fleet of 420 cargo vessels. Their trucking operations move 85 million tons of food products across highways worldwide each year. In Brazil alone, Cargill controls 35% of soybean exports, owns 67 grain terminals, operates 23 crushing plants, and manages 156 agricultural retail locations that supply seeds, fertilizers, and credit to farmers across an area larger than Texas. Their Brazilian operations process soybeans that become cooking oil in China, livestock feed in Europe, and biodiesel in the United States. A single Cargill facility in Santarém processes 1.5 million tons of soybeans annually from 15,000 farmers across 3 Brazilian states. Their Ukrainian operations demonstrate similar scale and integration. Cargill controls 28% of Ukraine's grain exports through their ownership of port terminals in Odessa and Mykolaiv. Their grain elevators store wheat and corn from 45,000 Ukrainian farmers across 18 regions. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, European food security immediately depended on whether Cargill could maintain operations in Ukrainian ports under wartime conditions. Government officials in Berlin, Paris, and Rome found themselves negotiating with Cargill executives about European bread supplies rather than conducting diplomacy with Ukrainian agricultural ministries. In Indonesia, Cargill owns palm oil plantations covering 180,000 hectares and processing facilities that refine 2.3 million tons of palm oil annually. This palm oil becomes ingredients in food products sold across Asia, cooking oil used in restaurants throughout Europe, and biofuel components in American gasoline. Indonesian government agricultural policies must account for Cargill plantation operations that employ 67,000 workers and affect the economic survival of 23 rural communities. When governments need food during emergencies, they negotiate with Cargill. When international aid organizations distribute food relief, they purchase through Cargill networks. When developing nations experience food shortages, Cargill determines whether food assistance is available and at what price. During the 2008 global food crisis, governments in 34 countries negotiated directly with Cargill executives to secure emergency grain shipments when traditional diplomatic channels couldn't guarantee food access. During COVID-19 lockdowns in 2020, Cargill coordination centers in Minneapolis managed food distribution to 89 countries when government logistics systems faced disruption. The Cargill family doesn't participate in global food markets. They are the global food market. Their trading floors in Geneva determine daily prices for wheat traded in Chicago, soybeans purchased in São Paulo, corn shipped from Ukraine, and rice sold in Bangkok. Their logistics coordinators in Singapore manage shipping schedules that determine when food reaches markets in Lagos, Jakarta, Mumbai, and Mexico City. Their credit managers in Minneapolis approve agricultural loans that determine what crops are planted across Iowa, what livestock are raised in Oklahoma, and what equipment farmers purchase in Nebraska. We're on stage 6 of 7. The Dreyfus family made it to stage 6 before nationalization destroyed them. So did the Medici before technological changes eliminated their monopoly. The Roman Aurelius family lasted longer, but the pattern is the same. We're not at the end yet, but we're deep into the sequence that has destroyed every previous food empire in human history. Stage 7 would be government intervention and systematic dismantlement. This is what this stage looks like historically. Governments realize that private families controlling food systems pose existential threats to national sovereignty and public welfare. Regulatory agencies begin investigating food pricing manipulation. International trade organizations challenge agricultural monopolies. Military planners identify food system dependencies as national security vulnerabilities. Political leaders face public pressure to break up agricultural cartels that control human survival. We're seeing early signs of this stage beginning to develop. The European Union has initiated investigations into agricultural commodity price manipulation. The United States Department of Agriculture has proposed new regulations on agricultural biotechnology licensing. China has established state-controlled agricultural trading companies to reduce dependency on foreign commodity traders. India has created government-managed food distribution systems that bypass private agricultural corporations. The cracks are forming in the political tolerance for private control over global food security. But here's what should terrify you about the current situation. The Cargill family has achieved a level of food system control that makes government intervention far more complicated than it was when previous food empires were dismantled. They don't just control agricultural trading like the Dreyfus family. They control the genetic foundation of modern agriculture through biotechnology ownership. They don't just own transportation infrastructure like historical food monopolies. They control the financial systems that farmers depend on for economic survival. If governments attempted to nationalize Cargill operations tomorrow, global food production would collapse within months. The seeds that farmers plant, the fertilizers they apply, the credit they use to operate, the processing facilities that turn crops into food, and the distribution networks that move food to consumers are all integrated into Cargill-controlled systems. Breaking up the Cargill empire would require unprecedented international coordination and massive government investment in alternative agricultural infrastructure. The Cargill family has created a food system dependency that exceeds anything achieved by the Roman Empire, Renaissance Italy, or early industrial grain trading. They've made themselves too essential to eliminate quickly and too powerful to regulate effectively. That's not market success. That's systematic control over human survival disguised as private enterprise. Chapter 5. The Scale of Total Control. Before we examine the genetic revolution that sets Cargill apart from all historical precedents, you need to understand the pure mathematical scale of their current food system control. These aren't market share statistics. These are measurements of control over human survival that exceed anything achieved by any private organization in human history. Cargill processes food that feeds 3 billion people every day. Every 24 hours, their facilities handle grain that becomes bread for families in Cairo, meat that becomes dinner for families in São Paulo, cooking oil that prepares meals for families in Mumbai, and fertilizers that grow vegetables for families in Lagos. Their supply chains coordinate food production, processing, and distribution across 125 countries simultaneously. Their logistics networks ensure that grocery stores in Tokyo have rice, restaurants in London have cooking oil, and bakeries in Mexico City have flour. The mathematical scope of this coordination is staggering. Cargill manages 2.3 million individual farming relationships worldwide. They coordinate with 89,000 food processors, distributors, and retailers. They operate 1,800 production facilities across 6 continents. They manage 67,000 logistics contracts that move food from farms to consumers daily. They process financial transactions worth $165 billion annually in agricultural commodities. Their meat processing operations demonstrate the scale of industrial food control. Cargill slaughterhouses process enough beef daily to provide hamburgers for 48 million people. Their pork processing facilities produce enough meat daily for 67 million meals. Their poultry operations slaughter and process enough chicken daily to feed 156 million people. These aren't periodic operations. This is daily industrial food production that must operate continuously to prevent massive food shortages in cities worldwide. Their grain processing capabilities represent similar industrial scale. Cargill facilities mill enough wheat daily to produce bread for 78 million people. Their corn processing plants produce enough animal feed daily to support livestock operations that eventually feed 134 million people. Their soybean crushing facilities produce enough cooking oil daily for meal preparation for 245 million people. Their rice milling operations process enough grain daily to provide meals for 89 million people. But scale alone doesn't explain Cargill food system control. The genius is coordination across multiple scales simultaneously. Their Brazilian soybean operations coordinate with their Chinese processing facilities to supply cooking oil to Asian markets. Their Ukrainian grain terminals coordinate with their Egyptian milling operations to supply bread flour to North African cities. Their American corn processing coordinates with their European livestock feed distribution to support meat production across the Atlantic. This coordination operates in real time across different time zones, currencies, languages, political systems, and regulatory frameworks. Cargill coordination centers monitor global food flows 24 hours daily, adjusting shipments, processing schedules, and distribution plans based on changing weather conditions, political developments, economic fluctuations, and transportation disruptions. They manage global food systems with the precision and integration that governments use to manage military operations during wartime. Their technological infrastructure makes this coordination possible. Cargill operates satellite monitoring systems that track crop conditions on 180 million acres of farmland worldwide. Their weather prediction systems forecast agricultural impacts 90 days ahead across 45 countries. Their logistics tracking systems monitor the location and condition of food shipments on 12,000 trucks, 890 ships, and 2,300 railroad cars simultaneously. Their financial systems process agricultural payments, commodity trades, and currency exchanges worth $450 million daily. But the most significant aspect of Cargill's scale is dependency creation. The 3 billion people who eat food processed through Cargill systems aren't customers making voluntary purchases. They're dependent populations whose survival requires Cargill operational continuity. The cities where Cargill supplies 60% or more of food imports would face famine within weeks if Cargill operations were disrupted. The rural regions where Cargill purchases 70% or more of agricultural production would face economic collapse if Cargill stopped buying crops. Consider the dependency relationships in specific regions. In West Africa, Cargill controls 45% of cooking oil imports, 38% of rice imports, and 52% of wheat imports. Cities like Lagos, Accra, and Dakar depend on Cargill supply chains for basic food security. If Cargill stopped shipping food to West Africa tomorrow, 67 million urban residents would face food shortages within 2 weeks. Their governments would face social unrest, political instability, and potential regime change triggered by food crisis. In Southeast Asia, Cargill processes 41% of palm oil production, 35% of rice distribution, and 28% of livestock feed manufacturing. Countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand have structured their agricultural economies around Cargill purchasing agreements and processing contracts. If Cargill operations were eliminated, these nations would lose their primary agricultural export markets and face rural economic devastation, affecting 45 million farmers and agricultural workers. In Eastern Europe, Cargill coordinates 34% of grain exports, 41% of agricultural credit, and 29% of farming technology distribution. Ukraine, Romania, and Poland have become dependent on Cargill networks for agricultural modernization and international market access. Their agricultural sectors employ 23 million people, whose economic survival depends on Cargill continued operations and expansion. This is mathematical control over human survival that operates through essential service provision, rather than political authority. Cargill doesn't govern the populations that depend on their food systems, but their operational decisions affect human welfare more directly than most government policies. They can trigger food crises, economic instability, and social unrest in dozens of countries simply by adjusting their normal business operations. The scale of this control exceeds government authority in many domains. The European Union can regulate agricultural policy, but they cannot replace Cargill food imports if political tensions disrupt supply relationships. The United States can implement agricultural programs, but they cannot coordinate global food flows with the precision and efficiency that Cargill systems provide. China can manage domestic food production, but they depend on Cargill commodity imports to feed their urban populations. Governments have political authority over territory and populations, but Cargill has operational control over the food systems that determine whether political authority can be maintained during crisis situations. They've achieved power over human survival that operates parallel to government authority rather than under government control. This is the scale of food system control that sets up everything that follows. The genetic revolution, financial integration, and political influence that make Cargill unprecedented all operate within this foundation of mathematical control over human survival at industrial scale. Chapter 6: The Genetic Revolution. But the Cargill Empire extends far beyond historical food control patterns into territory that no previous dynasty ever imagined: ownership of the biological foundations of agriculture itself. While traditional food monopolies controlled transportation, storage, and trading, the Cargill family recognized that the biotechnology revolution offered opportunities for unprecedented agricultural control. In 1998, they established Cargill Ventures to acquire agricultural biotechnology companies developing genetically modified crops. They purchased seed companies that controlled plant genetics, agricultural chemical companies that developed crop protection products, and livestock genetics firms that managed animal breeding programs. This wasn't traditional agricultural trading expansion. This was systematic acquisition of the biological infrastructure that determines what food can be produced and how it can be grown. The technical scope of this genetic control is extraordinary. Through their subsidiary companies and joint ventures, Cargill influences the genetic characteristics of corn grown on 78 million acres in the United States, soybeans planted on 45 million acres in Brazil, wheat cultivated on 34 million acres in Ukraine, and rice grown on 23 million acres in Vietnam. They don't just purchase crops from farmers. They determine what genetic varieties farmers are allowed to plant through seed licensing agreements that give Cargill legal ownership over the biological characteristics of crops. Their genetic control operates through intellectual property licensing rather than physical ownership. When farmers purchase genetically modified corn seeds from Cargill subsidiary companies, they're signing licensing agreements that give Cargill legal rights over any crops produced from those seeds. Farmers can plant the seeds and harvest the crops, but they cannot save seeds for replanting without paying additional licensing fees. They cannot sell crops to competing processors without Cargill approval. They cannot modify farming practices without adhering to Cargill-specified protocols. This creates biological dependency relationships that exceed anything achieved by traditional agricultural monopolies. When the Roman Aurelius family was eliminated, alternative grain suppliers existed in other regions. When the Medici networks collapsed, alternative trade routes could be established. When the Dreyfus Empire was dismantled, independent farmers could continue agricultural production with different buyers and distribution systems. But if Cargill genetic licensing was terminated tomorrow, farmers worldwide would lose access to crop varieties that have been bred specifically for modern agricultural equipment, chemical applications, and climate conditions. The genetically modified corn that farmers have planted for 25 years wouldn't be available for purchase. The soybean varieties adapted to no-till farming systems wouldn't be legally accessible. The wheat varieties resistant to specific diseases and pests wouldn't be distributed through normal channels. Crop yields would decline dramatically as farmers attempted to use traditional seed varieties that haven't been bred for contemporary farming conditions. Agricultural equipment designed for genetically modified crops wouldn't function efficiently with traditional varieties. Chemical applications optimized for specific genetic traits would be less effective or potentially harmful when used on different crop types. The mathematical impact would be catastrophic. Agricultural researchers estimate that eliminating genetically modified crops worldwide would reduce global grain production by 35 to 40% within 2 growing seasons. This would eliminate food supplies for approximately 1.2 billion people, triggering the largest famine in human history. The Green Revolution that enabled population growth from 3 billion to 8 billion people during the late 20th century was based on agricultural technologies that are now controlled through Cargill genetic licensing systems. But genetic control extends beyond crop varieties into livestock breeding programs that determine meat production worldwide. Cargill subsidiary companies control genetic material used for breeding cattle, pigs, and poultry in 67 countries. Their animal genetics determine growth rates, feed conversion efficiency, disease resistance, and meat quality characteristics for livestock that produce food for 2.1 billion people annually. Their livestock genetic programs operate through artificial insemination services, embryo transfer technologies, and genetic testing systems that optimize animal breeding according to Cargill specifications. Farmers who use Cargill livestock genetics aren't just purchasing breeding services. They're entering contractual relationships that give Cargill influence over their animal production decisions, feed purchasing requirements, and meat sales arrangements. The integration of crop genetics and livestock genetics creates comprehensive biological control over food production systems. Cargill controls both the genetic characteristics of corn and soybeans that become livestock feed and the genetic characteristics of cattle and pigs that consume that feed. They coordinate plant breeding and animal breeding programs to optimize integrated food production systems that serve Cargill operational requirements rather than independent agricultural decisions. This biological integration operates at industrial scale across multiple species and agricultural systems simultaneously. Their corn genetics coordinate with their cattle genetics to optimize beef production efficiency. Their soybean genetics coordinate with their pig genetics to optimize pork production systems. Their wheat genetics coordinate with their poultry genetics to optimize chicken and egg production operations. But genetic control also creates strategic vulnerabilities that could destabilize Cargill operations rapidly. Genetically modified crops with limited genetic diversity are vulnerable to new diseases and pests that could devastate agricultural production across multiple regions simultaneously. Livestock breeding programs that prioritize rapid growth and feed efficiency often create animals with compromised immune systems that are vulnerable to disease outbreaks. Climate change is creating agricultural stress conditions that could expose weaknesses in Cargill genetic technologies. Crops bred for specific temperature and precipitation patterns may fail when climate conditions change rapidly. Livestock bred for controlled environments may suffer when extreme weather events disrupt normal farming operations. Genetic modifications that optimize production under historical conditions may become liabilities under future climate scenarios. The concentration of genetic control in Cargill systems creates systemic risks that could trigger cascade failures across global food production. If disease outbreaks, climate stresses, or technical problems affected Cargill genetic technologies, the agricultural disruption could affect multiple crops and livestock species across different continents simultaneously. The biological integration that makes Cargill powerful could become the mechanism that amplifies agricultural disasters across their entire global food system. And genetic control is accelerating exponentially. Cargill biotechnology divisions are developing new genetically modified crops that are resistant to climate change, require less water and fertilizer, and produce higher yields per acre. They're creating genetically modified livestock that grow faster, resist diseases more effectively, and convert feed into meat more efficiently. They're establishing intellectual property rights over genetic traits that could determine the future biological foundation of global agriculture. As climate change, population growth, and resource scarcity increase pressure on global food production, governments and farmers are becoming more dependent on Cargill genetic technologies that promise agricultural sustainability and enhanced food security. The environmental and demographic challenges that threaten traditional agriculture are becoming strategic opportunities for Cargill to deepen their biological control over global food systems. Chapter 7. The Financial Web. The biotechnology revolution was just the beginning. The Cargill family's masterstroke was recognizing that controlling agricultural finance would give them deeper power over global food systems than infrastructure or genetics alone could provide. In 2005, Cargill established comprehensive agricultural lending programs that provide farmers with credit for land purchases, equipment acquisition, seed and fertilizer purchases, and operational expenses. But this wasn't traditional agricultural lending. These programs included clauses that gave Cargill first rights to purchase crops, requirements that farmers use Cargill-approved seeds and fertilizers, and mandatory participation in Cargill crop insurance and futures contracts. Farmers who accepted Cargill credit weren't just borrowing money. They were entering contractual relationships that gave Cargill control over their planting decisions, farming practices, crop sales, and financial planning. This created farmer dependency that extended far beyond simple debt obligations into comprehensive agricultural life control. Today, Cargill Financial Services provides credit to agricultural operations in 67 countries. They offer loans to farmers in Brazil, credit lines to agricultural cooperatives in Ukraine, equipment financing to ranchers in Australia, and crop insurance to grain producers in Argentina. These aren't independent financial transactions. These are components of an integrated global system that uses financial leverage to coordinate agricultural production according to Cargill's strategic objectives. Consider how this financial web operates in practice. A corn farmer in Iowa accepts a Cargill loan to purchase additional farmland. The loan agreement requires the farmer to purchase seeds from Cargill genetic subsidiaries, use fertilizers from Cargill chemical operations, and sell the harvest through Cargill grain elevators. The farmer's crop insurance is provided through Cargill insurance subsidiaries, and his futures contracts are managed through Cargill commodity trading operations. That farmer isn't an independent agricultural producer. He's a Cargill contractor who owns his land but operates according to Cargill specifications. His planting decisions are determined by Cargill seed licensing requirements. His fertilizer applications follow Cargill chemical protocols. His harvest schedule coordinates with Cargill processing facility operations. His crop sales generate profits that flow through Cargill trading networks. Multiply this individual farmer relationship by millions of agricultural operations worldwide, and you understand the scope of Cargill financial control over global food production. Farmers on every continent are financially dependent on Cargill for credit, insurance, futures contracts, and crop sales. Their agricultural decisions are coordinated through Cargill financial systems that ensure global food production serves Cargill strategic interests rather than local food security needs. But financial control creates even deeper dependencies than infrastructure or genetic control. Farmers can potentially find alternative seed suppliers or transportation networks. But farmers who have borrowed money for land purchases and equipment acquisitions can't easily escape debt obligations that may extend for decades. Financial dependencies create long-term relationships that give Cargill sustained influence over agricultural operations worldwide. The mathematical scope of this financial web is staggering. Cargill Financial Services manages approximately $45 billion in agricultural loans, credit lines, and insurance contracts globally. This financial leverage influences agricultural decisions on over 500 million acres of farmland worldwide, affecting crop production that feeds approximately 2 billion people. When farmers make planting decisions each spring, they're not responding to local food needs or regional market conditions. They're implementing agricultural production plans that serve the financial requirements of their Cargill loan agreements. When harvest seasons arrive, crops are sold through Cargill networks that coordinate global food flows according to Cargill profit objectives rather than human nutritional needs. This is food system control that operates through financial engineering rather than physical infrastructure. Farmers retain legal ownership of their land and crops, but their agricultural decisions are determined by contractual obligations to Cargill financial systems. This creates the appearance of independent agricultural production, while ensuring that global food production serves Cargill interests. The genius of financial control is that it's nearly impossible for governments to regulate effectively. When the Dreyfus grain empire was dismantled, governments could nationalize grain elevators, storage facilities, and shipping networks. But Cargill financial relationships with farmers are private contractual agreements that would be difficult for governments to void without triggering massive legal challenges and international trade disputes. Breaking up Cargill's financial control over global agriculture would require governments to assume responsibility for agricultural credit systems that provide hundreds of billions of dollars in loans to farmers worldwide. This would represent the largest agricultural nationalization program in human history, involving coordination between dozens of national governments and massive public investment in alternative agricultural financing. The Cargill family has created financial dependencies that make their agricultural empire too complex to dismantle quickly and too expensive for governments to replace easily. They've achieved food system control through financial engineering that would require unprecedented international cooperation to eliminate. And financial control is accelerating. As climate change and geopolitical instability increase risks for agricultural production, farmers are becoming more dependent on Cargill financial services for crop insurance, weather protection, and market volatility management. The uncertainties that threaten traditional agriculture are becoming strategic opportunities for Cargill to deepen their financial control over global food systems. The family that started by owning grain elevators in Minnesota now controls the financial infrastructure that determines agricultural production decisions worldwide. They don't just own your dinner, they own the debt relationships that determine whether your dinner gets planted in the first place. Chapter 8. The Political Machine. But infrastructure control, genetic ownership, and financial leverage are just the foundation of Cargill power. The family's ultimate achievement is building a political influence machine that protects their agricultural empire from government intervention, while expanding their control over global food systems through regulatory capture and policy manipulation. Cargill's government affairs operations employ over 300 lobbyists worldwide who work to influence agricultural policy in major food-producing nations. They maintain offices in Washington, D.C., Brussels, Beijing, Brasilia, and New Delhi that coordinate political strategies designed to prevent agricultural monopoly investigations, eliminate trade barriers that limit Cargill expansion, and establish regulatory frameworks that favor large-scale agricultural operations over small-scale farming. This isn't traditional corporate lobbying focused on specific legislation. This is systematic political engineering designed to ensure that government agricultural policies serve Cargill interests while appearing to promote general agricultural development and food security. Cargill lobbyists don't just oppose regulations that would limit their operations. They draft legislation that expands their market access, write regulatory guidelines that eliminate their competitors, and establish trade agreements that prioritize Cargill-controlled supply chains. Consider how Cargill political influence operates in practice. When the United States Congress considers agricultural subsidies, Cargill lobbyists ensure that subsidy programs favor large-scale agricultural operations that purchase Cargill seeds, fertilizers, and credit services. When the European Union develops biotechnology regulations, Cargill representatives ensure that regulatory frameworks favor genetically modified crops developed by Cargill subsidiary companies. When international trade organizations negotiate agricultural agreements, Cargill advisors ensure that trade rules facilitate Cargill expansion into new markets. Cargill political operations extend far beyond lobbying into what specialists call regulatory capture, a process where government agencies responsible for regulating industries become dominated by personnel with professional and financial ties to the companies they're supposed to oversee. Former Cargill executives hold senior positions in agricultural departments worldwide. Current government agricultural officials often join Cargill after completing their public service. Regulatory agencies rely on Cargill data, analysis, and expertise to make policy decisions about agricultural markets that Cargill dominates. This creates government decision-making processes where Cargill interests are represented throughout the policy development, implementation, and enforcement chain. Agricultural regulations are written by former Cargill employees, implemented by government officials who plan to work for Cargill, and enforced by agencies that depend on Cargill cooperation for their technical expertise. The result is agricultural policy that appears to serve public interests while systematically advantaging Cargill operations. Food safety regulations that seem designed to protect consumers actually favor large-scale processing facilities over small-scale food production. Environmental policies that appear to promote sustainable agriculture actually require biotechnology solutions that Cargill subsidiary companies provide. International trade agreements that seem focused on global food security actually establish market structures that favor Cargill-controlled supply chains. But Cargill political influence extends beyond regulatory capture into what intelligence analysts call soft power projection, using economic leverage to influence government decisions without explicit political pressure. When developing nations need food assistance during emergencies, Cargill-controlled supply chains often provide that assistance through government aid programs. When agricultural development projects require technical expertise, Cargill subsidiary companies often provide that expertise through international development agencies. When trade disputes threaten food security, Cargill networks often provide alternative supply arrangements that resolve political tensions. This creates relationships where governments become dependent on Cargill cooperation for their ability to respond to food crises, implement agricultural development programs, and maintain food security during geopolitical conflicts. Governments don't just regulate Cargill operations. They depend on Cargill operations for their ability to manage agricultural challenges and fulfill their food security obligations to their populations. The mathematical scope of this political dependency is extraordinary. Cargill operations provide food assistance in 45 countries during emergency situations. They supply agricultural technology and expertise for development projects in 78 nations. They manage supply chain logistics for government food programs in 23 countries. They provide agricultural consulting services for policy development in 56 nations. When governments face agricultural crises, they're not evaluating independent policy options. They're choosing between alternatives that all involve Cargill participation and cooperation. When international food emergencies require rapid response, the supply chains and expertise necessary for effective response are controlled by Cargill networks. When agricultural development requires technical solutions, the biotechnology and infrastructure necessary for implementation are owned by Cargill subsidiary companies. This is political influence that operates through essential service provision rather than traditional lobbying or campaign contributions. Governments become dependent on Cargill cooperation for their ability to fulfill their basic responsibilities to ensure food security for their populations. This dependency makes government regulation of Cargill operations extremely difficult because regulatory enforcement could disrupt the very services that governments depend on for agricultural crisis response. The Cargill family has achieved political influence that exceeds anything accomplished by previous agricultural empires. They don't just lobby governments to protect their business interests. They've made their business operations essential to government functioning in agricultural and food security domains. They've created political dependencies that make government intervention in their agricultural empire potentially catastrophic for the governments that attempt such intervention. And political influence is accelerating. As climate change and geopolitical instability increase the frequency and severity of agricultural crises, governments are becoming more dependent on Cargill networks for emergency response capabilities. The uncertainties that threaten traditional government agricultural planning are becoming strategic opportunities for Cargill to deepen their political influence through essential service provision. The family that started by storing grain in Minnesota now influences agricultural policy decisions worldwide through systematic regulatory capture and political dependency creation. They don't just own your dinner, they influence the government decisions that determine whether your dinner is legal, safe, and available. Chapter 9. The Information Empire. Beyond physical infrastructure, genetic control, financial systems, and political influence, the Cargill family has achieved something that no previous food dynasty even attempted: comprehensive control over agricultural information and data systems that determine how farming decisions are made worldwide. In 2010, Cargill established digital agriculture divisions that provide farmers with precision farming technologies, satellite monitoring systems, and data analytics platforms. But these aren't simple agricultural technology services. These systems collect detailed information about farming operations worldwide, including soil conditions, crop yields, weather patterns, planting decisions, fertilizer applications, pest management, harvest timing, and market sales. This agricultural data flows into Cargill analytics systems that create comprehensive intelligence about global food production patterns, crop yield predictions, regional agricultural strengths and vulnerabilities, farmer financial conditions, and supply chain bottlenecks. Cargill knows more about global agricultural conditions than any government agency, international organization, or academic research institution. Consider the strategic implications of comprehensive agricultural data control. When Cargill commodity traders make decisions about crop purchases and pricing, they're operating with detailed real-time information about global supply and demand conditions that other market participants don't possess. When Cargill executives plan expansion into new agricultural markets, they have precise intelligence about local farming conditions, competitive landscapes, and infrastructure requirements. When Cargill lobbyists advocate for agricultural policies, they possess data about agricultural impacts that government officials and policy researchers lack. This is information asymmetry that creates systematic advantages for Cargill operations while leaving farmers, governments, and competitors operating with incomplete or inaccurate agricultural intelligence. Farmers who use Cargill precision agriculture services are providing detailed data about their operations that helps Cargill optimize their broader agricultural strategies. Governments that rely on Cargill agricultural analysis for policy development are making decisions based on information that serves Cargill interests rather than independent agricultural research. But information control extends far beyond data collection into what technology specialists call algorithmic decision-making, using artificial intelligence and machine learning systems to influence farming decisions through automated recommendations and predictive analytics. Cargill's digital agriculture platforms don't just collect data about farming operations. They provide farmers with algorithmic recommendations about planting decisions, fertilizer applications, pest management, harvest timing, and crop sales. These recommendations appear to serve farmer interests by optimizing crop yields and maximizing farm profits. But the algorithms that generate these recommendations are designed to serve Cargill's strategic objectives by coordinating global agricultural production according to Cargill supply chain requirements, commodity trading positions, and market expansion plans. When millions of farmers worldwide receive algorithmic recommendations from Cargill digital agriculture platforms, they're implementing farming decisions that coordinate global agricultural production according to Cargill's strategic interests. Individual farmers believe they're making independent decisions based on technical analysis of their specific farming conditions. In reality, they're participating in a globally coordinated agricultural production system that serves Cargill objectives while appearing to serve farmer interests. The mathematical scope of this information control is staggering. Cargill digital agriculture platforms monitor farming operations on over 250 million acres worldwide. Their data systems track agricultural production that feeds approximately 1.5 billion people. Their algorithmic recommendation systems influence farming decisions that affect crop yields, commodity prices, and food availability on every continent. When farmers make daily decisions about irrigation, fertilization, pest control, and harvest scheduling, they're often implementing algorithmic recommendations generated by Cargill artificial intelligence systems. When agricultural researchers study global food production patterns, they're often analyzing data collected through Cargill monitoring systems. When government officials develop agricultural policies, they're often relying on analysis produced by Cargill research divisions. This is food system control that operates through information architecture rather than physical infrastructure. Farmers retain ownership of their land and legal authority over their farming decisions, but their agricultural choices are influenced by algorithmic systems that coordinate global food production according to Cargill strategic requirements. The genius of information control is that it's completely invisible to the farmers, governments, and organizations that depend on Cargill data systems. Unlike infrastructure ownership or financial dependency, information control doesn't require obvious contractual relationships or explicit policy interventions. Farmers who use Cargill precision agriculture services believe they're accessing neutral technology that serves their farming interests. Government officials who rely on Cargill agricultural analysis believe they're using objective research that serves policy development needs. Breaking up Cargill information control would require governments to develop alternative agricultural data systems that could match the scope, accuracy, and analytical capability of Cargill digital agriculture platforms. This would require massive public investment in satellite monitoring systems, artificial intelligence development, and agricultural research infrastructure that would take decades to develop and cost hundreds of billions of dollars. The Cargill family has created information dependencies that make their agricultural empire nearly impossible for governments to understand, regulate, or replace effectively. They control not just physical agricultural systems, but the knowledge systems that determine how agricultural decisions are made worldwide. They don't just own your dinner. They control the information that determines how your dinner is planned, planted, and produced. And information control is accelerating exponentially. As artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies advance, Cargill digital agriculture systems are becoming more sophisticated and more influential in coordinating global agricultural production. Climate change and agricultural uncertainty are creating demand for precision farming technologies that deepen farmer dependency on Cargill information systems. The uncertainties that threaten traditional agriculture are becoming strategic opportunities for Cargill to establish comprehensive control over agricultural decision-making through algorithmic coordination of global farming operations. But here's what makes the current situation fundamentally different from every historical precedent. The Cargill family has achieved comprehensive food system control during a period of converging global crises that make their empire simultaneously more powerful and more vulnerable than any food dynasty in human history. Climate change is disrupting traditional agricultural patterns worldwide, creating demand for genetically modified crops, precision farming technologies, and global supply chain coordination that only Cargill-scale operations can provide. Geopolitical tensions are fragmenting international trade relationships, creating opportunities for private agricultural networks that can operate across political boundaries. Economic instability is increasing farmer dependency on agricultural credit, insurance, and guaranteed purchase agreements that Cargill financial systems provide. Each crisis strengthens specific aspects of Cargill food system control while creating vulnerabilities that could trigger rapid empire collapse. This is the perfect storm scenario that no previous food dynasty faced. unprecedented power combined with unprecedented systemic risks. Climate change impacts on agriculture are accelerating Cargill genetic control over global food production. Traditional crop varieties developed for historical climate patterns are becoming inadequate for agricultural production under changing temperature and precipitation conditions. Farmers worldwide are becoming dependent on genetically modified crops that can resist drought, flooding, heat stress, and new pest pressures. Cargill subsidiary companies control most of the biotechnology research, developing climate-adapted crop varieties, making farmers increasingly dependent on Cargill genetic resources for agricultural viability. But climate change also creates systematic risks for agricultural infrastructure that could destabilize Cargill operations rapidly. Extreme weather events threaten grain storage facilities, transportation networks, and processing plants that Cargill depends on for operational coordination. Sea level rise threatens port facilities that Cargill uses for international commodity shipments. Changing precipitation patterns threaten agricultural regions where Cargill has concentrated infrastructure investments. Geopolitical tensions are increasing demand for Cargill agricultural networks that can supply food across political boundaries during trade disputes, sanctions, and conflict situations. When traditional diplomatic and trade relationships fail, Cargill supply chains often provide alternative arrangements that ensure continued food flows between nations. This makes Cargill operations valuable to governments that need reliable food import access during international tensions. But geopolitical instability also creates political risks for agricultural empires that operate across multiple jurisdictions. When nations prioritize food security during crisis situations, private agricultural monopolies become targets for nationalization, regulation, and forced restructuring. Military planners increasingly identify agricultural dependencies as strategic vulnerabilities that require government control during emergency situations. Economic uncertainty is increasing farmer dependency on Cargill financial services, while creating systematic risks for agricultural lending operations. Farmers facing volatile commodity prices, unpredictable weather patterns, and changing market conditions are more dependent on agricultural credit, insurance, and guaranteed sales contracts that Cargill provides. This expands Cargill influence over global agricultural decision-making during economic stress periods. But economic instability also threatens the financial systems that support Cargill agricultural operations. Agricultural loans become riskier during periods of commodity price volatility and farm income uncertainty. International trade financing becomes more expensive during banking sector stress. Currency fluctuations threaten profitability of international agricultural operations that depend on stable exchange rates. The convergence of climate, geopolitical, and economic crises creates a situation where Cargill food system control is simultaneously accelerating and becoming more vulnerable to sudden disruption. Each crisis increases farmer and government dependency on Cargill operations while creating conditions that could trigger rapid empire collapse if multiple stress factors align simultaneously. This is the perfect storm scenario. Maximum food system control achieved during maximum systematic instability. The Cargill family has built their empire during the most favorable conditions for agricultural monopolization in human history, but they're operating during the most dangerous period for agricultural stability since the Industrial Revolution began. Historical food empires collapsed when they faced single challenges: technological change, political intervention, or military defeat. The Cargill Empire faces simultaneous challenges across climate, geopolitical, and economic domains that could interact unpredictably to create cascade failures throughout their integrated agricultural systems. But the perfect storm scenario could also strengthen Cargill food system control if they successfully navigate converging crises while their competitors and potential government alternatives fail. Climate change that disrupts traditional agriculture could increase dependency on Cargill genetic technologies. Geopolitical tensions that fragment international trade could increase dependency on Cargill supply networks. Economic instability that threatens agricultural financing could increase dependency on Cargill financial services. The Cargill family could emerge from current global crises with even greater food system control if they prove more resilient and adaptable than government alternatives. They could achieve total food system control that exceeds anything accomplished by historical food empires if converging crises eliminate their competitors while strengthening their essential service provision. This is the historical moment where the pattern could complete itself with Cargill empire collapse, or where the pattern could be broken permanently with Cargill achieving irreversible control over global food systems. The mathematical probability favors empire collapse based on historical precedents, but the scope of current Cargill control exceeds all historical precedents. We're not just watching another food empire approach its inevitable destruction. We're watching the potential permanent elimination of the possibility that future governments could ever regain control over global food systems. The perfect storm will determine whether the pattern continues or whether human food security becomes permanently controlled by a single private family. What comes next in the pattern has always been the same: government intervention, systematic dismantlement, and return of food system control to public authority. But the Cargill empire has achieved a scale and integration of food system control that makes traditional government intervention potentially catastrophic for global food security. If governments attempted to replicate historical patterns by nationalizing Cargill operations, breaking up their agricultural monopoly, or regulating their food system control, the immediate consequences would be unprecedented agricultural chaos. Unlike previous food empires that controlled transportation and trading operations that could be replaced by government agencies, Cargill controls biological, financial, technological, and informational systems that would take decades to recreate. Consider what would happen if the United States government attempted to break up Cargill's agricultural operations tomorrow. Farmers across America would lose access to genetically modified seeds that they've used for decades and that have been bred specifically for their soil conditions and climate patterns. Agricultural credit systems that provide billions of dollars in farm loans would be disrupted, threatening spring planting schedules and farm operations nationwide. Grain storage and transportation systems that move crops from farms to consumers would face massive coordination challenges without Cargill logistics management. Food processing facilities that transform raw crops into consumer products would lose access to agricultural supplies that flow through Cargill distribution networks. Grocery stores and restaurants would face food shortages as supply chains that depend on Cargill coordination experience disruption. International food exports that provide agricultural income for American farmers would be disrupted as foreign buyers lost access to Cargill trading relationships. The agricultural chaos would extend far beyond the United States because Cargill operations are globally integrated. Breaking up American Cargill operations would disrupt food supplies to countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that depend on American grain exports coordinated through Cargill networks. International food assistance programs would face massive disruption as the logistics systems that deliver emergency food aid are controlled by Cargill subsidiary companies. Multiply this scenario across all the countries where Cargill maintains major operations: Brazil, Argentina, Ukraine, Australia, India, Indonesia, and dozens of others, and the scale of potential agricultural disruption becomes clear. Simultaneous government intervention in Cargill operations worldwide would trigger the largest food system collapse in human history, potentially creating famine conditions that could affect billions of people. This is why the Cargill Empire has achieved a level of food system control that makes government intervention far more dangerous than allowing continued private monopolization. They've made their operations so essential to global food security that eliminating their control could cause more human suffering than maintaining their dominance. But the endgame scenario isn't necessarily government intervention. Climate change, geopolitical instability, and economic volatility could trigger Cargill empire collapse through systematic failure rather than political action. If extreme weather events simultaneously damaged agricultural infrastructure in multiple regions where Cargill has concentrated operations, their global coordination systems could face cascade failures that no private company could manage effectively. If geopolitical tensions escalated into trade wars or military conflicts that disrupted international agricultural shipments, Cargill's globally integrated supply chains could become strategic vulnerabilities rather than competitive advantages. If economic crises triggered massive defaults on agricultural loans, Cargill's financial systems could face liquidity problems that destabilize their operations worldwide. The endgame could be systemic collapse triggered by the same converging crises that have strengthened Cargill food system control. The integration that makes their empire powerful also makes it vulnerable to cascade failures that could destroy global food security faster than government intervention. But there's a third endgame scenario that should terrify anyone concerned about human freedom and dignity: Cargill achieving permanent, irreversible control over global food systems that becomes too essential for any government to challenge. If climate change makes traditional agriculture completely impossible without Cargill genetic technologies, if geopolitical instability makes global food trade impossible without Cargill logistics networks, if economic uncertainty makes agricultural production impossible without Cargill financial systems, then government intervention becomes impossible regardless of political will. In this scenario, the Cargill family doesn't face government dismantlement like previous food empires. They become the permanent, essential infrastructure of human survival that no government can afford to regulate, nationalize, or replace. They achieve food system control that exceeds government authority because their operations become more critical to human survival than government services. This would represent the permanent end of the historical pattern where government intervention eliminates private food monopolies. It would establish a new historical pattern where private families control human survival while governments become secondary authorities that manage social and political issues but cannot challenge essential infrastructure controlled by agricultural empires. The mathematical trajectory suggests this third scenario is becoming increasingly probable. Climate change is accelerating farmer dependency on Cargill genetic technologies. Geopolitical instability is increasing government dependency on Cargill logistics networks. Economic uncertainty is deepening agricultural dependency on Cargill financial systems. Each crisis makes Cargill operations more essential while making government alternatives more expensive and risky to implement. We may be witnessing the historical moment when the pattern of food empire collapse is broken permanently by an agricultural dynasty that achieves truly irreversible control over human survival. The Cargill family could become the first private empire in human history that successfully resists the historical forces that destroyed all previous attempts at food system monopolization. Or we may be approaching the most catastrophic collapse in agricultural history as an oversized, over-integrated food empire faces systematic challenges that exceed any private organization's capacity to manage effectively. The same integration that makes Cargill powerful could make their potential collapse more dangerous to global food security than any previous agricultural disaster. The endgame will determine whether human food security remains under potential government control or becomes permanently controlled by private interests that exceed government authority. We're not just watching another food empire approach its historical destiny. We're watching the potential permanent transformation of the relationship between private power and public authority over human survival. 3 families controlled food systems and believed they were permanent. The Roman Aurelius family controlled grain supplies for 800,000 Romans and believed the empire couldn't survive without them. The Medici family controlled food imports for 15 million Europeans and believed their banking empire made them untouchable. The Dreyfus family controlled 40% of global grain trade and believed their international networks were too large for any government to challenge. They were wrong every single time. Each empire fell when governments realized that private control over food systems posed existential threats to public welfare and national sovereignty. Each family that had seemed untouchable was eliminated within a single generation when political authorities decided that human survival couldn't be controlled by private interests. The pattern has been mathematical for 2,000 years. Private food empires grow through infrastructure capture, vertical integration, geographic expansion, and political influence until they achieved temporary monopolization. Then, systematic challenges, technological change, geopolitical shifts, economic instability, or government intervention expose their vulnerabilities and destroy their power permanently. But the Cargill family has broken every historical precedent for food system control. They don't just own transportation and trading networks like their predecessors. They control the genetic foundation of modern agriculture, the financial systems that support global farming, the technological infrastructure that coordinates agricultural decisions, and the information systems that determine how food production is planned and implemented worldwide. They've achieved integration across every domain of food system control that makes their empire simultaneously more powerful and more fragile than any food dynasty in human history. They control more aspects of global food production than the Aurelius, Medici, and Dreyfus empires combined, but their integrated systems face more potential failure points than any previous agricultural monopoly. We're telling ourselves the same lies that every previous generation told themselves when they faced food empire dominance. We believe market competition will eventually challenge Cargill monopolization. We believe government regulation can control agricultural corporations that have become essential infrastructure. We believe technological innovation will create alternatives to Cargill-controlled systems. But the pattern doesn't care about market ideology or regulatory optimism. The pattern is mathematical. You cannot maintain private control over human survival indefinitely without triggering systematic resistance. You cannot achieve monopolization over essential resources without creating vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit. You cannot integrate global systems without creating cascade failure risks that exceed any private organization's management capacity. You cannot avoid the historical forces that have destroyed every previous attempt at food system monopolization. Once those forces align against private empire control, the sequence of challenge, resistance, and collapse is locked into the dynamics of private power versus public authority over essential resources. The only question is timing. Maybe we have 5 years before systematic challenges to Cargill food system control become overwhelming. Maybe 10 years. Maybe less if climate change, geopolitical tensions, or economic instability accelerate beyond Cargill management capacity. But the pattern says agricultural empire collapse is inevitable once empires achieve the scale and visibility that Cargill has reached. And when the collapse comes, it won't be gradual decline. It'll be sudden systematic failure that could destabilize global food security more rapidly and completely than any agricultural disaster in human history. The integrated systems that make Cargill powerful will become cascade failure mechanisms that amplify collapse across multiple domains simultaneously. Genetic dependencies will trigger crop failures. Financial dependencies will trigger agricultural credit crises. Technological dependencies will trigger coordination failures. Information dependencies will trigger decision-making chaos. Overnight, the family that controls global food systems becomes the cause of the worst food security crisis in human history. The infrastructure that seemed essential becomes the vulnerability that threatens human survival. The empire that appeared permanent becomes a catastrophic reminder of why private control over essential resources always fails eventually. 4 times the pattern has played out. The Roman Empire, Renaissance Italy, the global grain trade of the early industrial age, and now the biotechnology agricultural empire of the digital age. Each time, private families achieved greater food system control than previous attempts. Each time, their empires seemed more permanent and essential than historical precedents. Each time, systematic challenges destroyed their power completely. Maybe the Cargill family will find a way to break the pattern that has destroyed every previous food empire in human history. Maybe they'll successfully manage the converging climate, geopolitical and economic crises that threaten integrated agricultural systems. Maybe they'll achieve permanent control over human food security that exceeds government authority permanently. But the pattern says otherwise. The mathematics of private power versus systematic challenges says otherwise. And history, which has watched food empires rise and fall for 2 millennia, says we're about to learn the same lesson that every previous generation learned about the impossibility of permanent private control over human survival. If this analysis opened your eyes to where we actually are in the historical sequence of food empire development and collapse, understand that you're watching the potential end of private control over global food systems. The pattern suggests that within our lifetimes we'll witness either the permanent establishment of private food empire control or the most catastrophic agricultural collapse in human history. The mathematics are clear. The historical precedents are consistent. The timeline is evident. The only question is whether you'll recognize what's happening before the pattern completes itself. 3 times private families controlled food systems and fell when governments intervened. Once more, a private family has achieved greater food system control than any historical precedent during a period of systematic instability that could trigger either permanent empire establishment or catastrophic empire collapse. The pattern is playing out again, but the stakes have never been higher. The answers aren't hidden in the future, they're written in the past. And the past says that private control over human survival always ends the same way. The only question is, how much damage will be done before history repeats itself one final time?